words that simply say, you are an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe.
I was about 7 years old at the time, and we just moved into a farmhouse built in the 1800s. And I heard noises in the night, and that was unusual. I didn't expect the obvious, that it might be my parents arguing, because my dad was a Pentecostal holiness minister, and so you didn't argue, didn't talk loudly, you didn't dance, it didn't make noise unless you were at the altar. So I tiptoed down the hallway, and I peeked into the crack between the door and the door frame, and I saw the strangest sight I've ever seen. My parents were fighting. I thought. They weren't really fighting. It was worse than that. No. This is not. This is not. No. So, yeah. That's for you. That's for you. So, this is about to take a turn. So I sat down on this vinyl-covered pine bench, and I looked, and things seemed different. My dad, who's typically very much like a Franciscan monk, that demeanor had left the stage, and his eyes looked kind of wild, and there was kind of words falling like salad from the air, and I sat down. And I was witnessing my dad on the early end of a nervous breakdown. My mom saw me, and so she quieted things down, and he quieted down. I walked back to the room, and in the bed, I took her arm, and I assured her everything's going to be fine in the morning. That was in fact, it would be hard to overestimate the impact of that moment in my life. For one thing, I became a psychologist. You might have seen that coming. I reasoned that I was going to spend a lot of time in a psychologist's office. I wanted to be able to pick the best chair in the room. And also, the fact that it was different the next morning made me think a lot about an invisible God who might listen when a kid asks for something. So, 16 years later, we pack up a U-Haul truck, Regina and I, and we drive across the country, and we settle into a remarkable adventure. Incredible professors and friends that I still have. But about a year in, I noticed something seems a little bit odd with this family in a different sort of way. I just noticed there are things that we don't talk about here. And I wondered why. And then things got worse because I forget where Richard is, but I actually went to a talk you were doing at Fuller. Your teaching assistant was Jim Smith, and it was on this book, Celebration of Discipline. It's been out for a couple of years. And it was mesmerizing, and I got a copy, and I started giving it as gifts, and I went on a retreat for the first time, and not far from here, La Casa de Maria. And this, I kind of realized, I think I see what's missing. We're not talking in the family of integration that I was in about invisible things like spirit and soul. It was almost like it was a subtle embarrassment to talk about that. So during the time in school and for years of private practice, I started living sort of a schizophrenic life. On the one hand, I was reading the best stuff I could find on treatment strategies and helping people with behavior and thought changes. And on the other part of my life, I was reading spiritual classics through the centuries. And that was really helping me. And so for a long time I wondered, really, I think I said it something like this, because I am from Georgia, why am I selling the Boone's Farm at such a premium while I'm drinking the good stuff at home? And that bothered me. For those who don't know, like F, Boone's Farm is a nice fluorescent wine. So I got the diagnosis eventually for what was going on, So I'd like to read this to you. Leslie Weatherhead wrote these words in a book, Transforming Friendship. Psychology has its place as material medicine has, but neither is to be regarded as a substitute for the dynamic spiritual energy which the church of the first century knew. We're trying to make do with both because we're not prepared to pay the price which a healing church cost. We pretend that in the first century healing miracles are being repeated by psychotherapeutic treatments. We interview a patient for hundreds of hours, separate hours, and then rejoice when he or she does not limp quite so badly. But the apostles could say, in the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk. We weren't talking about stuff like that, and I understand that. That's a hard thing to talk about. This is, the educational program was stunning. I kept thinking and reading, and at some point, I got a fundraising note from my alma mater. I won't tell you which school it was, but we had a very successful Rose Bowl this year. And I'm reading through this, and it's stating the history of the progress and history of the department. In 1800, psychology is represented as a moral and mental philosophy at this institution. 1897, first psychology course is philosophical in orientation. 1902, the first laboratory course in psychology is taught. 1970s, just before I arrived in mid to late 70s, psychology is the science of behavior. 1990s, major research grants awarded for psychology as neuroscience. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I mean, psychology is becoming a modern science, and I'm grateful for everything that I learned. But there's something missing. You're progressively moving away from invisible things and talking about invisible things. So you are studying to be a soulologist, but you're not talking about the soul. These next slides are from Thomas Oden, one of the many mentors of Chris Hall. But anyway, Tom Oden wrote a book on classical approaches to soul care, and he just flashed these charts in there. In the 1900s, across the top, you see the prominent pastoral, not psychologists, pastoral theologians. You see their names, and you see the number of times they reference who they're referencing, and they're referencing folks like Augustine and Luther and Calvin and on and on. He counted 314 references. He then looked 100 years later, different writers, of course, because can't live forever, but this is who they were writing in the 20th century, who they were referencing. No references to the original group. All the references are to psychologists, basically. It's like pastoral counseling even was following psychology and saying, we're a little embarrassed about these invisible things. So that's the diagnosis. That's what people weren't talking about. But I'll talk to you about the treatment. Around 1988, 89, a good friend gave me a copy of a book. It was the blue and blue course-covered hardback edition of the Spirit of the Disciplines. He said, you've got to read this. And so we were living Norfolk, Virginia Beach at the time, and I remember, just like it was yesterday, I'm lying on this blue, ugly, this sofa that never had a beautiful day in its life. It's blue and gray, and I'm lying on my back. And I'm reading this book, and these words obviously jumped out at the page, off the page. Authentic transformation really is possible if you're willing to do one thing, and that is to arrange your life around the things Jesus practiced in order to receive power from the Father. And it went on, and it went on. I found out later, that very same weekend, a friend, I would tell you his name, but it would be name dropping, and Billy Graham has warned me about that before he passed away, read the same book the same weekend and had the same experience. This is what we aren't talking about. This is the missing thing. So before tagging out to my two colleagues here, I just want to share with you what I feel like are the 4 most important things that I learned from Dallas Willard as the psychologist. And I'll say these things while we're looking at his model of the person together. First thing, the importance of the executive center, the CEO of the self, the importance of will, heart, and spirit. I look forward to a psychology that puts more attention on will, heart, and spirit, the executive center. It's done with thoughts, it's done with feelings, it's done with social relationships. Why not willingness versus willfulness? I keep returning to the two trees in the garden, the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I think they're the trees of willingness and surrender, and the tree of independence and a kind of egocentric living. But learning more about what it means to live willingly. Second thing is a hope for a psychology that puts more focus on programs of transformation that actually work. As you know, Dallas said that he would not trust a program of formation that didn't significantly resemble AA. What does AA start with? I give up. My ego self does not know how to manage the situation. So why not more focus on that, even though you are dealing with invisible things, and programs like Ignatian spirituality, programs like ancient Christian spirituality, whatever the program that works. Third thing is more focus on Jesus being really smart. I had a similar revelation to Daniel. Thank you for that. But just the notion, what if, as psychologists, as spiritual directors, as counselors, you just assume maybe the creator of me is actually very smart. And so when Jesus says things like, what is real? And he responds, the kingdom, that needs more study. Or if he says, who is well off? Anybody who has stepped into John 17:3 and is interacting with the Trinity. Who's a good person? Anybody pervaded by love? Can you imagine being pervaded by love not having mental health implications? How do I become a good person? I apprentice myself to Jesus, the living presence. To underscore, for the fourth thing, I've used this a lot. I love this painting. I'm almost done. This is, of course, Breaking Home Ties by Norman Rockwell. It reminds me of Dallas Willard. I picture him as the young man leaving the farm, going off to the university, to the city to study. What often happens, and the sadness with this photo, is the children don't come back home. But to me, that's one of the many geniuses of Dallas. He left the farm, he left the invisible landscape and went off to the city to study about the visible, the tangible, the measurable, but he came back home. So the fourth thing would be to take Dallas incredibly seriously with the four things that he says summarized his writing, his four critical concerns. And you know what they are. As he said very powerfully to J.P. Moreland, I won't say it as a philosopher would say it because I wouldn't understand it, but that there is an invisible reality that's actually there, kingdom, Trinity. 2, you can interact with that reality. 3, we're uniquely designed to do just that. And 4, if that's really happening, it should produce real and measurable change in the individual. Last thing, a couple of years ago, my mom's still alive, she's 96. She has stopped racing motorcycles, and the last time I used sound psychological reasoning, I gave her some advice, and I said she was worried about memory issues. Time's up? No. Okay, this is the last thing. I picked up a copy of something and read it, and it was handwritten, and it was my dad's valedictorian address from college. And I was both sad and delighted. I was sad because I never met the man that wrote that. After I met him, a lot of that person wasn't still there. But it's not a sad story. He was a pastor 50 years. He had a wonderful marriage for 50 years. When he died, the church was packed, and it was for one reason. He actually believed that when you talk to Jesus, Jesus walks right up for a conversation, and he lived in that conversation. Thank you.